quiet of the evening, where shadows softly play, a fairy tale wolf sheds his skin, gently drifting away, with a twinkle in his eye and a heart full of dreams. He waits for the Friday night glow, where the magic redeems. Oh, the wolf in the moonlight, he's found his true call, reading tales of wonder for one and for all. In a world of stars dancing, his spirit takes flight, with stories of beauty under the starlit night. He picks up a book, the pages worn and wise, every line a whisper under the vast skies, from far off lands where the wild things roam, to enchanted forests where the heart finds home. Oh, the wolf in the moonlight, he's found his true call, reading tales of wonder for one and for all. In a world of stars dancing, his spirit takes flight, with stories of beauty under the starlit night. With every word he reads, he casts a spell of peace, transporting all who listen to a land where joy won't cease. For in these fairy tales, amidst the laughter and tears, the wolf finds his solace, he conquers his fears. As the night grows deeper, he serenades the moon with melodies that linger, a soft and soothing tune. In this sacred hour, where magic abounds, the fairy tale wolf writes love into sound.
I really wish I could get that down to a 3-minute song. But anyway, it's Friday. You know what that means? Fairy tales. It also means I've been playing a lot more with the redeems, so... yeah. Ouch. No cats on the bed so far. So, we got that. So, it is the weekend, technically. I did go and look at a car today. Well, a van. I can't afford it, but, you know. Not on a streamer's salary. No, not even on an author's. Hey, Guilty, thank you for streaking. And congrats on getting first. Did you see the other one? So I've got Cake Shake and the booty. two different artists. The first one was done by Cubine. The second one was done by Yoicho. And Cubine is actually someone else I'm mod for. I seem to keep plucking white hairs from my beard. It's amazing how fast they grow. But yeah, we're doing fairy tales tonight. I don't know how many points you have, so I don't know if you can tinker around with some of your games I've got right now, but I've been upgrading some of them. Mostly stuff that happens to my model, so. Yeah. But we are starting a new book today. And it is, I can't really say it's a longer book. It's just one more done in chapters. And the new book is this one. I'm actually using a picture of the book. No picture of the copy I have. I'm eventually going to have to start putting links to the books and the streams I do. But this one is one that I can't remember if I put it on my reading list yet or not. Book. No, it's... Okay, my shop. And if people don't know, I have a shop on, what is this? Bookshop.org. Okay, I don't have it listed on here yet. Guess I need to add book 21 to the list. There's a Sviel in chat. Those who wish to Sviel chat. But the book is my own fairy book. And he actually titled it My Own Fairy Book because he wrote it while he was doing the other fairy books, of course. Did not have it hardback on here. And I prefer being able to do it hardback. Just because it's, you know, my personal preference. Nope, it does not look like Bookshop has my own storybook, or my own fairy book in hardback. Guess I will have to put the paperback version on. Which is strange, because it looks like it's republished by the same people who republish everything else. There's a hardcover. Wonder why they want advertisement. Okay. The book I'm reading is this one. Oh, come on. Cooperate, Twitch. Okay. This book. Got 2 edits to... children's stories narrated on stream. I'm fairly sure that Kel posted a link to my bookshop. At least I would hope she does. Otherwise, she's not... I would say she's not worth getting to pay, but I don't pay her, so... If anyone doesn't know about my bookshop, it is here. So, yeah. If you want to get the book and read along, you can. The book copy I got, sadly, I got it off of Amazon. But, well, it's where I could find a copy of it when I ordered it. Normally I would check eBay to see if I can get copies of older books, but this one, I already have an old copy of the first part of this one, that of Prince Prigio. But it's also in less than stellar condition, so I want to be a little bit more careful with it. Because it is... Let me grab my book and tell you when this one was printed. Because I have a copy of Prince Prigio currently in my hand. Including, it even has the onion skin page to protect the original art. It was printed in 1901. So, one more book in my collection that's over a century old. This was copyright 1901 by Thomas Y. Crowell and Company. So again, old book. And despite most of his introductions, Andrew Lang mentions that he thinks that chapter books will bore children. So when he wrote his particular fairy book, he wrote it that each chapter is essentially a story of its own. Anyone who I've given access to my my autobiography will notice I did the same thing. I started doing that before I even noticed that Andrew Lang was doing it this way in this book. So it's kind of cool that everything can be broken down into different stories and different chapters. And I'm going to try to keep this 100-year-old book in as good condition as I can. Without, remaking it entirely. I do have some books that I need to do that on, but I digress. But since we're here, and it is almost time, the people who printed the book I have, the one that's on screen, they literally, they scanned someone's personal copy, reprinted it. Which means there's at least one page that's blacked out. Then there's multiple pages that they did the dedication that someone gave it to them, because the copy of this book was originally given to Ellen Eyre Morgan from Mother and Father, a Valentine, 1896. So this is, at least in their wording, a lot older than the original book. So, hopefully I won't be coughing on that. But, going out and looking at cars, they got a lot of dust blowing around in the air, so not breathing well. But at least I don't have to be constantly changing voices, because this is consistent characters. So, let's get into the story, starting with the book and introduction. My own fairy book, namely certain chronicles of Pantoufla, and notably the adventures of Prigio, prince of that country, and of his son Ricardo, with an excerpt from the Annals of Scotland as touching Garret of Fairnilee, his sojourn with the Queen of the Fairy, and whole written by Andrew Lang and adorned by Gordon Brown, T. Scott, and E. A. Lamont. Bristol Aerosmith, 1895. New York, Longmans Green Company. To children. The author of this book is also the editor of the Blue-Green. The author of this book is also the editor of the Blue, Red, Green, and Yellow fairy books. He has always felt rather an impostor because so many children seem to think that he made up these books out of his own head. Now, he only picked up a great many old fairy tales told in French, German, Greek, Chinese, Red Indian, Russian, and other languages and had them translated and printed, with pictures. He is glad that children like them, but he must confess that they should be grateful to old forgotten people, long ago, who first invented these tales and who knew more about fairies than we can hope to do. My own fairy book, which you now have in your hands, was made up altogether out of his own head by the author. Of course, with the help of historical papers in the kingdom of Pantuflia. About that ancient kingdom very little is known. The natives speak German, but the royal family, as usual, was of foreign origin. Just as England has had Norman, Scottish, and, at present, a line of German monarchs, so the kings of Pantuflia are descended from an old Greek family, the Hypnotidae, who came to Pantuflia during the Crusades. They explained, not to be troubled with the Crusades, which they thought were injudicious and tiresome. The crest of the regal house is a dormouse, dormant, proper, on a field vert with the motto, when translated out of the original Greek, means anything for a quiet life. It may surprise the young reader that the princes like Prigio and Ricardo, whose feet were never in the stirrup and whose lances were always at rest, should be descended from the family of the Hypnotidae, who were remarkably lazy and peaceful. But these heroes doubtless inherited the spirit of their great ancestors, whose story is necessary to be known. On leaving his native realm during the Crusades in search of some secure asylum, the founder of the Pantuflian monarchy landed in the island of Cyprus, where, during the noontide heat, he lay down to sleep in a cave. Now, in this cave dwelt a dragon of enormous size and unamiable character. What was the horror of the exiled prince when he was aroused from slumber by the fiery breath of the dragon, and felt its scaly coils around him? "Oh, hang your practical jokes!" exclaimed the prince, imagining that some of his courtiers were playing a prank on him. "You call this a joke?" answered the dragon, twisting his forked tail into a line with his royal highness's eye. "Do not take that thing away." "Do take that thing away," said the prince, "and let a man have his nap peacefully." "Kiss me," cried the dragon, which had already devoured many gallant knights for declining to kiss it. "Give you a kiss?" murmured the prince. "Oh, certainly, if that's all. Anything for a quiet life." So saying, he kissed the dragon, which instantly became a most beautiful princess, for she had lain enchanted as a dragon by a wicked magician, so somebody should be bold enough to kiss her. "My love, my hero, my lord, how long I have waited for thee, and now I am eternally thine own." So murmured the most affectionate accents, the Lady Dragonessa, as she was now called. Though wedded to a bachelor life, the prince was much too well bred to make a remonstrance. Lady Dragonessa, a female of extraordinary spirit, energy, and ambition, took command of him and his followers and conducted them up the Danube, seized the principality whose lord had gone crusading, set her husband on the throne, and became in course of time the mother of the little prince, who again was the great-great-great-great-grandfather of our Prince Prigio. From his adventurous Lady Dragonessa, Prince Prigio derived his character for gallantry, but her husband, it is said, was often heard to remark, by a slight change of his family motto. Anything for a quiet wife. You now know as much as the author does of the history of Pantufia. As to the story called the Gold of Fairnilee, such adventures were extremely common in Scotland long ago, as may be read in many of the works of Sir Walter Scott and the learned in general. Indeed, Fairnilee is the very place where the Fairy Queen appointed to meet her lover, Thomas the Rhymer. With these explanations, the author leaves to the judgment of the young readers of his own fairy book. Prince Prigio. Preface. In compiling the following history from the archives of Pantufia, the editor has incurred several obligations to the learned. The Return of Benson, Chapter 12, is the fruit of the research of the late Mr. Alan Quatermain, while the final wish of Prince Prigio is suggested by the invention or erudition of a lady. A study of the Firedrake of South Africa, where it is called the Nanabulele, a difficult word, has been published in French, translated from the Basuto language, by M. Paul Celibat, in the Rêve de Traditions Populaires. For the Remora, the editor is indebted to the Voyage de la Lune of M. Cherno de Bergerac. And I recognize every name, especially Cherno. Chapter 1. Now the fairies were not invited to court. Once upon a time there reigned in Pantufia a king and a queen. With almost everything else to make them happy, they wanted one thing. They had no children. This vexed the king even more than the queen, who was very clever and learned, and who had hated dolls when she was a child. However, she too, in spite of all the books she read and all the pictures she painted, would have been glad enough to be the mother of a little prince. The king was anxious to consult the fairies, but the queen would not hear of such a thing. She did not believe in fairies. She said that they had never existed, and that she maintained, though, the history of the royal family was full of chapters about nothing else. Well, at long and at last, they had a little boy who was generally regarded as the finest baby that had ever been seen. Even Her Majesty herself remarked that, though she could never believe what the courtiers told her, yet he was certainly a fine child, a very fine child. Now the time drew near for the christening party, and the king and queen were sitting at breakfast in their summer parlor talking over it. It was a splendid room hung with portraits of the royal ancestors. There was Cinderella, the grandmother of the reigning monarch, with her little foot and her glass slipper thrust out before her. There was the Marquis de Carabas, who, as everyone knows, was raised to the throne as prince consort after his marriage with the daughter of the king of the period. On the arm of the throne was seated the celebrated cat, wearing boots. There, too, was a portrait of a beautiful lady sound asleep. This was Mademoiselle la Belle Bois Domant, also an ancestress of the royal family. Many other pictures of celebrated persons were hanging on the walls. You have asked all the right people, my dear," said the king. "Everyone who should be asked," answered the queen. "People are so touchy on these occasions," said His Majesty. "You have not forgotten any of our aunts." "No, the old cats," replied the queen, for the king's aunts were old-fashioned and did not approve of her, and she knew it. "They are very kind old ladies in their way," said the king, "and were nice to me when I was a boy." Then he waited a little and remarked, "The fairies, of course, you have invited. It has always been usual in our family on occasions like this, and I think we have neglected them a little of late." How can you be so absurd? Cried the queen. How often must I tell you there are no fairies? And even if there were, but no matter. Pray, let us drop the subject. They're very old friends of our family, my dear. That's all, said the king timidly. Often and often they have been godmothers to us. One in particular was most kind and most serviceable to Cinderella. I, her own grandmother. Your grandmother, interrupted Her Majesty. Fiddle-dee-dee, if anyone puts such nonsense into the head of my little Prigio. But here the baby was brought in by the nurse, and the queen almost devoured it with kisses, and so the fairies were not invited. It was an extraordinary thing, but none of the nobles could come to the christening party when they had learned that the fairies had not been asked. Some were abroad, several were ill, a few were in prison among the Saracens, others were captives in dens of ogres. The end of it was that the king and queen had to sit down alone, one at each end of a very long table arrayed with plates and glasses for 100 guests, or 100 guests who never came. Any soup, my dear? Shouted the king, through a trumpet speaking, when suddenly the air was filled with a sound like rustling of wings of birds. Flitter, 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 went the noise, and when the queen looked up, lo and behold, on every seat was a lovely fairy, dressed in green, each with a most interesting-looking parcel in her hand. Don't you like opening parcels? The king did, and he was most friendly and polite to the fairies. But the queen, though she saw them distinctly, took no notice of them. You see, she did not believe in fairies, nor in her own eyes when she saw them. So she talked across the fairies to the king, just as if they had not been there, but the king behaved as politely as if they were real, which, of course, they were. When dinner was over, and when the nurse had brought in the baby, all the fairies gave him the most magnificent presents. One offered a purse which could never be empty, and one a pair of 7-leagued boots, another a cap of darkness that nobody might see the prince when he put it on, and another a wishing cap, and another a carpet on which, when he sat, he was carried wherever he wished to find himself. Another made him beautiful forever, and another brave, and another lucky. But the last fairy of all, an old crossing, crept up and said, My child, you shall be too clever. This fairy's gift would have pleased the queen if she had believed in it, more than anything else, because she was so clever herself. But she took no notice at all, and the fairies went each to their own country, and none of them stayed there at the palace, where nobody believed in them, except the king, a little. But the queen tossed all her nice boots and caps and carpets and purses and swords and all away into a dark lumber room, for, of course, she thought that they were all nonsense and merely rubbish out of books or pantomime properties. The queen is not starting off on a good foot. Chapter 2. Prince Prigio and his family. Well, the little prince grew up. I think I've told you that his name was Prigio, didn't I? Well, that was his name. You cannot think how clever he was. He argued with his nurse as soon as he could speak, which was very soon. He argued that he did not like to be washed because the soap got into his eyes. However, when he was told about the pores of the skin and how they could not be healthy if they were not washed, he at once ceased to resist, for he was very reasonable. He argued with his father that he did not see why there should be 2 kings who were rich. He argued with his father that he did not see why there should be kings who were rich, while beggars were poor, and why the king, who was a little greedy, should have poached eggs and plum cake at afternoon tea, while so many other persons went without dinner. The king was so surprised and hurt at these remarks that he boxed the prince's ears, saying, I'll teach you to be too clever, my lad. Then he remembered the awful curse of the oldest fairy, and was sorry for the rudeness of the queen. When the prince, after having his ears boxed, said that force was no argument, the king went away in a rage. Indeed, I cannot tell you how the prince was hated by all. He would go down into the kitchen and show the cook how to make soup. He would visit the poor people's cottage and teach them how to make the beds and how to make plum pudding out of turnip tops and venison cutlets out of rusty bacon. He showed the fencing master how to fence and the professional cricketer how to bowl, and instructed the rat catcher in breeding terriers. He set sums to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and assured the royal astronomer that the sun does not go around the earth. Which, for my part, I believe it does. The young ladies of the court disliked dancing with him, in spite of his good looks, because he was always asking, "Have you read this?" and "Have you read that?" When they said they hadn't, he sneered, and when they said they had, he found them out. He found out all his tutors and masters in the same horrid way, correcting the accent of his French teacher, trying to get his German tutor not to eat peas with his knife. He also endeavored to teach the Queen Dowager, his grandmother, an art with which she had long been perfectly familiar. In fact, he knew everything better than anyone else, and the worst of all was that he did. And he never was in the wrong, and he always said, "Didn't I say so?" Or what more, he had. As time went on, Prince Prigio had two younger brothers, whom everybody liked, though they were not a bit clever, but jolly. Prince Alfonso, the third son, was round, fat, good-humored, and as brave as a lion. Prince Enrico, the second, was tall, thin, and a little sad, but never too clever. Both were in love with two of their own cousins, with the approval of their dear parents, and all the world said, "What nice unaffected princes they are!" Prigio nearly got the country into several wars by being too clever for the foreign ambassadors. Now, as Pantuflia was a rich, lazy country which hated fighting, this was very unpleasant and did not make people love Prince Prigio any better. Chapter 3. About the Firedrake. Of all the people who did not like Prigio, his own dear papa, King Gregornio, disliked him most, for the king knew he was not clever himself. When he was in the counting-house counting out his money, when he happened to say 16 shillings and 14 and 2 pence, so 3 pounds 15, it made him wild to hear Prigio whisper, 1 pound 10 and 2 pence, which of course it is. And the king was afraid that Prigio would conspire and get himself made king, which was the last thing Prigio would want. He much preferred to idle about and know everything without seeming to take any trouble. Well, the king thought and thought how he was to get Prigio out of the way and make Enrico or Alfonso his successor. He read in books about it, and all the books showed that if a king sent his 3 sons to do anything, it was always the youngest who did it and got the crown. And he wished he had the chance. Well, it arrived at last. There was a very hot summer. It began to be hot in March. All the rivers were dried up. The grass did not grow. The corn did not grow. The thermometers exploded with the heat. The barometers stood at set fair. The people were much distressed, and came and broke the palace windows, as they usually do when things go wrong at Tuflia. The king consulted the learned men about the court, who told him that probably a Firedrake was in the neighborhood. Now, the Firedrake is a beast or bird about the bigness of an elephant. Its body is made of iron, and it is always red hot. More terrible and cruel beasts cannot be imagined, for if you go near it, you are at once broiled by the Firedrake. But the king was not ill-pleased, for he thought, of course my 3 sons must go after the brute, the eldest first, and, as usual, it will kill the first 2, and be beaten by the youngest. It is a little hard for Enrico, poor boy, but anything to get rid of that Prigio. Then the king went to Prigio and said that his country was in danger, and that he was determined to leave the crown to whichever of them would bring him the horns, or it has horns, and tail of the Firedrake. That is an awkward brute to tackle. It is an awkward brute to tackle, the king said. But you are the eldest, my lad. Go where glory waits you. Put on your armor, and be off with you. This the king said, hoping that either the Firedrake would roast Prince Prigio alive, which he could easily do, as I have said, for he is all over as hot as red poker, or that, if the prince succeeded, at least his country would be freed of the monster. But the prince, who was lying on the sofa doing sums and compound division for fun, said in the politest way, "Thanks to the education your majesty has given me, I have learned that the Firedrake, like the siren, the fairy, and so forth, is a fabulous animal which does not exist. But even granting, for the sake of argument, that there is a Firedrake, your majesty is well aware that there is no kind of use in sending me. It is always the eldest son who goes out first and comes to grief on these occasions, and it is always the third son that succeeds. Send Alfonso," this was the youngest brother, "and he will do the trick at once. At least, if he fails, it will be the most unusual, and Enrico can try his luck." Then he went back to his arithmetic and to his slates, and the king had to send the Prince Alfonso and Prince Enrico. They both came in very warm, for they had been whipping tops, and the day was unusually hot. "Look here," said the king. "You two younger ones, look at Prigio. You see how hot it is, and how coolly he takes it, and the country's suffering, and all on account of a Firedrake, you know, which has apparently built his nest not far off. Well, I've asked that lot of brothers to kill it, and he says—" "That he does not believe in Firedrakes," interrupted Prigio. "The weather's warm enough without going out hunting." "I don't not believe in Firedrakes," said Alfonso. "I wonder what you do believe in. Let me get at the creature," for he was as brave as a lion. "Aye, page, my mail armor, my helmet, and lance and buckler. A Molinda, a Molinda," which was his war cry. The page ran to get his armor, but it was so uncommonly hot that he dropped it and put his fingers in his mouth, crying. "You'd better put the flannels, Alfonso, for this kind of work," said Prigio. "And if I were you, I'd take a light garden engine full of water to squirt at the enemy." "Happy thoughts," said Alfonso. "I will." And off he went and kissed his dear Molina, and bade her keep a lot of dances for him. There was to be a dance when he had killed the Firedrake, and then he rushed off to the field. But he never came back any more. Everyone wept bitterly, everyone but Prince Prigio, for he thought it was a practical joke, and said that Alfonso had taken the opportunity to start off on his travels and see the world. "This is some dreadful mistake, sir," said Prigio to the king. "You know well as I do that the youngest son always succeeds up to now. But I will entertain great hopes for Enrico." And he grinned, for he fancied it was all nonsense, and that there were no Firedrakes. Enrico was present when Prigio was consoling the king in this unfeeling way. "Enrico, my boy," said his majesty, "the task awaits you, and the honor. When you come back with the horns and tail of the Firedrake, you shall be crowned prince, and Prigio shall be made an usher at the grammar school. It is all he is fit for." Enrico was not quite so confident as Alfonso had been. He insisted on making his will, and he wrote a poem about his pleasures and the advantages of dying young. This is part of it. "The violet is a blossom sweet that droops before the day is done, slain by thine overpowering heat, O sun! And I, like that sweet purple flower, may roast or boil or broil or bake, if burned by thy terrific power, Firedrake." This poem comforted Enrico more or less, and he showed it off to Prigio. But the prince only laughed and said that it was the second line and the last verse was not very good. The violets do not roast, boil, or broil, or bake. Enrico tried to improve it, but he could not. So he read it to his cousin, Lady Kathlina, just as it was, and she cried over it, though I don't think she understood it. And Enrico cried a little too. However, the next day he started with a spear, a patent refrigerator, and a lot of bottles people throw at fires to put them out again. But he never came back again. After shedding torrents of tears, the king summoned Prince Prigio to his presence. "Dastard," he said, "poultry, your turn, which should have come first, has arrived at last. You must fetch me the horns and the tail of the Firedrake. Probably you will be grilled, thank goodness. But who will give me back Enrico and Alfonso?" "Indeed, your majesty," said Prigio, "you must permit me to correct your policy. Your only reason for dispatching your sons in pursuit of this dangerous, but I believe fabulous animal, was to ascertain which of us would most worthy to succeed your throne, at the date, long may it be deferred, of your lamented disease. Now, there can be no further question about the matter. I, unworthy as I am, represent the sole hope for the royal family. Therefore, send me to the Firedrake were both dangerous and unnecessary. Dangerous because if he treats me as well as you did my brothers, my unhappy brothers, the throne of Pantufla will want an heir. But if I do come back alive, why, I cannot be more true heir than I am at present, now can I? Ask the Lord Chief Justice if you don't believe me." These arguments were so clearly and undeniably correct that the king, unable to answer them, withdrew to a solitary place where he could express himself with freedom and give rein to his passions. Chapter 4. How Prince Prigio was deserted by everybody. Meanwhile, Prince Prigio had to suffer many unpleasant things. Though he was the crown prince, and though his arguments were unanswerable, everybody shunned him for a coward. The queen, who did not believe in Firedrakes, alone took his side. He was only avoided by all. He had the most disagreeable scenes with his own cousins, Lady Melinda and Lady Kathlina. In the garden, Lady Melinda met him walking alone and did not bow to him. "Dear Molly," said the prince, who liked her, how have I been so unfortunate to offend you?" "My name, sir, is Lady Melinda," said she very proudly, "and you have sent your own brother to his grave." "Oh, excuse me," said the prince. "I am certain he has merely gone off on his travels. He'll come back when he's tired. There are no Firedrakes. The French writer says there are a purement fabuleux, purely fabulous, you know." "Prince Alfonso has gone on his travels and will..." "Prince Alfonso has gone on his travels and will come back when he is tired. And then he's tired of me." It's supposed to be her. "Prince Alfonso has gone on his travels and will come back when he is tired. And was he then tired of me?" cried poor Melinda, bursting into tears and forgetting her dignity. "Oh, I beg your pardon, I never noticed. I'm sure I'm very sorry," cried the prince, who, never having been in love himself, never thought of other people. And he tried to take Melinda's hand, but she snatched it from him and ran away through the garden to the palace, leaving Prince Prigio to feel foolish for once, and ashamed. As for Lady Kathlina, she swept past him like a queen without a word, so the prince, for all his cleverness, was not happy. After several days had gone by, the king returned from the solitary place where he had been speaking his mind. He now felt calmer and better, and so at last he came back to the palace. But on seeing Prince Prigio, who was lolling in a hammock, translating Egyptian hieroglyphics into French poetry for his mother, the king broke out afresh and made use of the most cruel and impolite expressions. At last he gave orders that all the court should pack up and move to a distant city, and that Prince Prigio should be left alone in the palace by himself. For he was quite unendurable, the king said. He could not trust his own temper when he thought of him. And he grew so fierce that even the queen was afraid of him now. The poor queen cried a great deal, Prigio being her favorite son on account of his acknowledged ability and talent, but the rest of the courtiers were delighted at leaving Prince Prigio behind. For his part, he, very good-naturedly, showed them the best and shortest road to Falkenstein, the city where they were going, and easily proved that neither the chief secretary for geography nor the general of the army knew anything about the matter, which indeed they did not. The ungrateful courtiers left Prigio with hoots and yells, for they disliked him so much that day, but they forgot that he would be king one day. He therefore reminded them of this little fact in future history, which made them feel uncomfortable enough, and then lay down in his hammock and went to sleep. When he awakened, the air was cold, and the day was beginning to grow dark. Prince Prigio thought he would go down and dine at the tavern in town, for no servants had been left with him. But what was his annoyance when he found that his boots, his sword, his cap, and his cloak, all his clothes, in fact, except for those he wore, had been taken away by the courtiers, merely to spite him. His wardrobe had been ransacked, and everything that had not been carried off had been cut up, burned, and destroyed. Never was such a spectacle of wicked mischief. It was as if hay had been made of everything he possessed. What was worse, he had not a penny in his pocket to buy new things, and his father had stopped his allowance of £50,000 a month. Can you imagine anything more cruel and unjust than this conduct? For it was not the prince's fault that he was so clever. The cruel fairy had made him so. But even if the prince had been born clever, as may have happened to you, was he to be blamed for that? The other people were just as much his fault for being born so stupid. But the world, my dear children, can never be induced to remember this. If you are clever, you will find it best not to let people know it, if you want them to like you. Well, here's the prince in a pretty plight, not a pound in his pocket, nor a pair of boots to wear, not even a cap to cover his head from the rain, nothing but cold meats to eat, and never a servant to answer the bell. Chapter 5. What Prince Prigio Found in the Garret. The prince walked from room to room of the palace, but unless he wrapped himself up in a curtain, there was nothing for him to wear when he went out in the rain. At last he climbed up the turret stair to the very oldest part of the castle, where he had never been before. At the very top was a little round room, a kind of garret. The prince pushed in the door with some difficulty. Not that it was locked, but the handle was rusty and the wood had swollen with the damp. The room was very dark, and only the last gray light of a rainy evening came through the slit of a window, one of those narrow windows that they used to fire arrows from at in old times. But in the dusk the prince saw a heap of all sorts of things lying on the floor and on the table. There were 2 caps. He put one on, an old, ugly gray cap it was, made of felt. There was a pair of boots, and he kicked them off his slippers, and he got into them. They were a good deal worn, but fitted like they had been made for. On the table there was a purse with just 3 gold coins, old ones too, in it, and this, as you fancy, the prince was very well pleased to put into his pocket. A sword with a sword belt he buckled about his waist, and the rest of the articles, a regular collection of odds and ends he left there just where they're lying. Then he ran downstairs and walked out the hall door. Chapter 6. What happened to Prince Prigio in town. By this time the prince was very hungry. The town was just 3 miles off, but he had such a royal appetite that he did not like the taste of it on bad cookery, and the people in the royal town were bad cooks. I wish I were in the Bear at Buxton, he said to himself, for he remembered that there was a very good cook there. But then the town was 21 leagues away, 63 long miles. No sooner had the prince said this than he had taken 3 steps, and he found himself at the door of the Bear Inn at Gluckstein. This is a most extraordinary dream, as he said to himself, for he was far too clever, of course, to believe in seven-league boots. Yet he had a pair on at that very moment, and it was they which carried him the 3 strides from the palace to Gluckstein. The truth is that the prince, looking about the palace for clothes, had found his way into that very old lumber room where the magical gifts of the fairies had been thrown by his clever mother, who did not believe in them. But this, of course, the prince did not know. Now, you should be told that 7-league boots only take those prodigious steps when you say you want to go a long distance. Otherwise, it would be very inconvenient when perhaps you only want to walk across a room, for example. Perhaps this was not explained to you by your governess. Well, the prince walked into the Bear, and it seemed odd to him that nobody took any notice of him. And yet his face was as well known as that of any man in Pantoufle, for everybody had seen it, at least in pictures. He was so puzzled by not being attended to as usual that he quite forgot to take off his cap. He sat down at a table, however, and shouted, "Kellner!" at which all the waiters jumped and looked around every direction, but nobody came to him. At first he thought they were too busy, and presently another explanation occurred to him. "The king," he said to himself, "has threatened to execute anybody who speaks to me or helps me in any way. Well, I don't mean to starve in the midst of plenty, anyhow. Here goes." The prince rose and went to the table in the midst of the room, where a huge roast turkey had just been placed. He helped himself to half the breast, some sausages, chestnut stuffing, bread sauce, potatoes, and a bottle of wine, Burgundy. Then he went back to the table in the corner, where he dined very well, nobody taking any notice of him. When he had finished, he sat watching the other people and smoking a cigarette. As he was sitting thus, a very tall man, an officer in the uniform of the guards, came in, and walking straight to the prince's table, said, "Kellner, clean this table and bring in the bill of fare." With these words, the officer sat down presently on the prince's lap, as if he did not see him at all. He was a very heavy man, and the prince, enraged at the insult, pushed away and jumped to his feet. As he did so, his cap dropped off. The officer fell on his knees, crying at once, "Pardon, my prince, pardon, I never saw you." This was more than the prince could be expected to believe. "Nonsense, Count Frederick von Matterhorn," he said. "You must be intoxicated. Sir, you have insulted your prince and your superior officer. Consider yourself under arrest. You shall be sent to prison tomorrow." On this, the poor officer appealed piteously to everybody in the tavern. They all declared that they had not seen the prince, nor ever had any idea what he was doing in the honor of being in the neighborhood of their own. More and more offended, and convinced that there was some conspiracy to annoy and insult him, the prince shouted for the landlord, called for his bill, and threw down the 3 gold pieces without asking for change, and went out into the street. "It is a disgraceful conspiracy," he said. "The king shall answer for this. I shall write to the newspapers at once." He was not put in a better temper by the way in which people hustled him in the street. They ran against him exactly as if they had not seen him, and then staggered back in the greatest surprise, looking in every direction for the person they had jostled. In one of these encounters, the prince pushed so hard against a poor old beggar woman that she fell down. As he was usually most kind and polite, he pulled off his cap to beg her pardon, when behold, the beggar woman gave out a dreadful scream and fainted. The crowd was collecting. The prince, forgetting that he had thrown down all his money in the tavern, pulled out his purse. Then he remembered what he had done and expected to find it empty. But lo, there were 3 pieces of gold in it. Overcome with surprise, he thrust the money into the woman's hand and put his cap on again. In a moment the crowd, which had been staring at him, rushed away in every direction with cries of terror, declaring that there was a magician in town, and a fellow who could appear and disappear at pleasure. By this time, you or I, or anyone who was not so extremely clever as Prince Prigio, would have understand what was the matter. He had put on, without knowing it, not only the 7-league boots, but the cap of darkness, and had taken Fortunatus's purse, which would never be empty, however often you took out all the money. And for those and many other delightful wares the fairies had given him at his christening, The prince had found them in the dark garret. But the prince was so extremely wise and learned and scientific that he did not believe in fairies, nor in fairy gifts. It is indigestion, he said to himself. Those sausages were not of the best, and the burgundy was extremely strong. Things are not as they appear. Here, as he was arguing with himself, he was nearly run over by a splendid carriage and six, the driver of which never took the slightest notice of him. Annoyed at this, the prince leaped up behind and threw down the two footmen, who made no resistance, and was carried off to the door of a magnificent palace. He was determined to challenge the gentleman who was in the carriage. Challenge the person who was in... Yeah. He was determined to challenge the gentleman who was in the carriage, but noticing that he had a very beautiful young lady with him, whom he had never seen before, he followed them into the house, not wishing to alarm the girl, and meaning to speak to the gentleman when he found him alone. A great ball was going on, but as usual, nobody took any notice of the prince. He walked among the guests, being careful not to jostle them, and listening to their conversations. It was all about himself. Everyone had heard of his disgrace, and almost everyone cried, "Serve him right!" They said that the airs that he gave himself were quite unendurable, that nothing was more rude than to be always in the right, that cleverness might be carried far too far, that it was even better to be born stupid, like the rest of you thought the prince. And in fact, nobody had a good word for it. Yes, one had. There was a pretty lady in the carriage. I never could tell you how pretty she was. She was tall, with cheeks like white roses blushing. She had dark hair and very large dark gray eyes, and her face was the kindest in the world. The prince first thought how nice and good she looked, even before he thought how pretty she looked. She stood up for the Prince Prigio when her partner would speak ill of him. She had never seen the prince, for she was but newly come to Pantuflia, but she declared that it was his misfortune, not his fault, to be made so clever. And then, think how hard they made him work at school, besides, said this kind young lady. I hear he is extremely handsome, very brave, and he has a good heart, for he was kind, I've heard, to a poor boy, and he did all his examination papers for him, so that the boy passed first in everything. Now he is a minister of education, though he can't throw a line of Greek prose. The prince blushed at this, for he knew this conduct had not been honorable. But he at once fell head over ears in love with the young lady, a thing he had never done in his life before, because, he said, women are so stupid. You see, he was so clever. Now, at this very moment, when the prince all of a sudden was deep in love as if he had been the stupidest officer in the room, an extraordinary thing happened. Something seemed to give a whir in his brain, and at instant he knew all about it. He believed in fairies and fairy gifts, and understood that his cap was a cap of darkness, and his shoes the seven-legged boots, and his purse a purse of Fortunatus. He had read about all those things in historical books, but now he believed in them. I am enjoying the hell out of this book. Because I know all the stories involved. Oh, this is definitely my kind of book. But we've got ads coming up, so we gotta do that thing. So I will see you in a couple minutes. What are you? Come on, Mike. Oh, oh. Microphone. There we go. I'm enjoying this book far too much. Knowing every little bit of the other fairy tales are dragged into this. Oh, they made all the fairy tale princes related for the story. And what's bad? The story kind of even relates to the Disney movie Wish. Um, just for the location in the prologue, an island in the Mediterranean where someone went in hopes of just finding a place of peace and quiet and avoid the Crusades. And ended up marrying a very fiery woman. Okay, Pantuflia said they went up the Danube from the Mediterranean. It would be hilarious if I were to start my lore story in the country that used to be Pantuflia. I may have to do some editing on my own book just to include that, because that's hilarious, the fact that they've got all this tied together. In fact, my Carrie's studying all these stories as history himself. It's just what the prince did. Damn. I'd never even heard of this book before, well, when I started writing my own. This is hilarious. Anyway, thank you for the stretch and hydrate. Interesting. I get this entire first book done tonight, because we're already in chapter 7 out of... Yeah, it's... This version of the book is 28 chapters long. We've already gotten to chapter 7, so we're a third of the way through it. No, fourth of the way through it. If I can math. Anyway. Chapter 7. The Prince Falls in Love. He understood all of this and burst out laughing, which nearly frightened an old lady near him out of her wits. Ah, how he wished he was only in evening dress. Oop, I don't know. Oh, dang it. Set. Everyone needs a head dinner. Okay, I'll start the He understood all of this and burst out laughing, which nearly frightened an old lady near him out of her wits. Ah, how he wished he was only in his evening dress, that he might dance with the charming young lady. But there he was, dressed just as he was going out to hunt, if anyone would have seen him. So even if he took off his cap of darkness and became visible, he was no figure for a ball. Once he would have not cared, and now he cared very much indeed. But the prince was not clever for nothing. He thought for a moment, then went out of the room, and in 3 steps of the 7 league boots, he was in his empty, dark, cold palace again. He struck a light with a flint and steel and lit a torch and ran upstairs to the garret. The flaring light of the torch fell on a pile of rubbish, as the queen would have called it, which he turned over with eager hands. Was there? Yes, there was another cap. There it lay, handsome green one with a red feather. The prince pulled off his cap of darkness and put on the other one. I wish I were dressed in my best suit of white and gold, with royal pantuflia diamonds. In one moment there was in white and gold, the greatest and most magnificent dandy in the whole world, and the handsomest. How about my boots, I wonder? Said the prince, for his 7-league boots were stout riding boots, and were not good to dance in, whereas now he was in elegant shoes of silver and gold. He threw down the wishing cap and put on the other, the cap of darkness, and made 3 strides in the direction of Gluckstein. But he was only 3 steps nearer to it than he had been, and the 7-league boots were standing beside him on the floor. No, said the prince, no man can be in 2 different pairs of boots at the same time. That's mathematics. Then he hunted about in the lumber room again until he found a small, shabby old Persian carpet, the size of a hearthrug. He went to his own room and took a portmanteau in his hand and sat down on the carpet and said, I wish I were in Gluckstein. In a moment there he found himself, for this was a famous carpet of the prince's sign bought long ago, the market of Bissender, in which the fairies had brought with other presents to the christening of Prince Prigio. When he arrived at the house where the ball was going on, he put the magical carpet in the portmanteau and left it in the cloakroom, receiving a numbered ticket in exchange. Then he marched in all his glory, and of course without the cap of darkness, into the room where they were dancing. Everybody made place for him, bowing down to the ground, and the loyal band struck up the prince's march. Heaven bless our friend Prigio, what is there he doesn't know? Greek, Swiss, German, high and low, at the names of the mountains in Mexico. Heaven bless the prince. He used to be very fond of this march, and the words. Some people even said he had made them himself. But now, somehow, he didn't much like it. He went straight to the Duke of Stumfelbein, the hereditary master of ceremonies, and asked to be introduced to the beautiful young lady. She was the daughter of the new English ambassador, and her name was Lady Rosalind. But she nearly fainted when she heard who it was that wished to dance with her, for she was not at all particularly clever, and the prince had such a bad character for snubbing girls and asking them difficult questions. However, it was impossible to refuse, and so she danced with the prince, and he danced very well. Then they sat out in the conservatory among the flowers, where nobody came near them. And when they danced again, and then the prince took her down to supper, all the time he never once said, Have you read this, or have you read that? Or, have you ever heard of Alexander the Great, or Julius Caesar, or Michelangelo, or whoever it might be, or difficult questions he used to ask? That was the way he used to go on. But now he only talked to the young lady about herself. And she quite left off being shy or frightened, and asked him all about his own country, and about the Firedrake shooting, and how fond she was of hunting herself. The prince said, Oh, if you wish it, you shall have the horns and tail of the Firedrake to hang up on your wall tomorrow evening. Then she asked if it was not very dangerous work, Firedrake. He said it was nothing, if you knew the trick to it. And he asked her if she would but give him a rose out of her bouquet, and in short, he made himself so agreeable and unaffected that she thought him very nice indeed. For even a clever person can be nice when he likes, above all when he is not thinking about himself. And now the prince was thinking of nothing in the world but the daughter of the English ambassador, and how to please her. He got introduced to her father, too, and quite won his heart, and at last he was invited to dine the next day at the embassy. In Pantuflia, it is a custom that a ball must not end while one of the royal family goes dancing. This ball lasted till the light came in, and the birds were singing outdoors, and all the mothers present were sound asleep. Then nothing would satisfy the prince but that they should all go home singing through the streets. In fact, there never had been so merry a dance in all of Pantufla. The prince had almost made a point of dancing with every girl there, and he had suddenly become the most beloved of the royal family. But everything must end at last, and the prince, putting on the cap of darkness and sitting on the famous carpet, flew back to his lonely castle. Chapter 8. The Prince is Puzzled. Prince Prigio did not go to bed. It was bright daylight, and he had promised to bring the horns and tail of Firedrake as a present to the pretty lady. He had said it was easy to do this, but now, as he sat and thought it over, he did not feel so victorious. First, he said, "Where is the Firedrake?" He reflected for a little, then ran upstairs to the garret. "It should be here," he cried, tossing the fairy's gifts about. "And by George, here it is!" Indeed, he had found the spyglass of carved ivory which Prince Ali in the Arabian Nights bought at the bazaar of Shiraz. Now this glass was made so that, by looking through it, you could see anybody or anything you wished, however far away. Prince Prigio's first idea was to look at this lady, but she does not expect to be looked at, he thought, and I won't. On the other hand, he determined to look for the Firedrake, for of course he had no delicacy in spying on him, the brute. The prince clapped his glass to the eye and stared out the window, and there, sure enough, he saw the Firedrake. He was floating about in a sea of molten lava on top of a volcano. There he was, swimming and diving for pleasure, tossing up flaming waves and blowing fountains of fire at his nostrils, like a whale spouting. The prince did not like the looks of him. "With all my cap of darkness and shoes of swiftness and sword of sharpness, I could never get near that beast," he said, "and if I did stalk him, I could not hurt him. Poor little Alfonso, poor Enrico, what plucky fellows they were. I fancied that there was no such thing as a Firedrake. He's not in the natural history books, and I thought the boys were only making fun, and would be back soon, safe and sound. No horror being so clever makes one. And now, what am I to do?" What was he to do, indeed, and what would you have done? Bring the horns and tail he must, or perish in the adventure. Otherwise, how could he meet his lady? Why, she would think him a mere braggart. The prince sat down and thought, and the day went on, and it was now high noon. At last he jumped up and rushed to the library, a room where nobody ever went except himself and the queen. There he turned the books upside down, and in haste, till he found an old one, by a French gentleman, Monsieur Cyrano de Bergerac. It was an account of a voyage to the moon, in which there was a great deal of information about matters not generally known, for few travelers have been to the moon. In that book, Prince Prigio fancied he would find something he half remembered and would be of use to him. It did. You see, that cleverness, minding in your book, has some advantages after all. For here the prince learned that there is a very rare beast called a remora, which is at least as cold as a Firedrake is hot. Now, he thought, if only I could make these two fight, or the remora may kill the Firedrake, or at least take the heat out of it, at least, so I may have a chance. Then he seized the ivory glass and clapped it to his eye and looked for the remora. Just as the tip of his nose, as white as snow and as smooth as ice, was sticking out of a chink in the frozen mountain, not far from the burning mountain of the Firedrake. "Ray," said the prince softly to himself, and he jumped like mad into the winged shoes of swiftness and stuck on the cap of darkness, girdled himself with a sword of sharpness, and put a good slice of bread and some cold tongue in his wallet, which he slung on his back. Never you fight if you can help it. Never you fight, if you can help it, except with plenty of food to keep you going, and in a good heart. Then he flew off, and soon reached the volcano of the Firedrake. Chapter 9. The Prince and the Firedrake. It was dreadfully hot, even high in the air, where the prince hung invisible. Great burning stones were tossed up by the volcano and nearly hit him several times. Moreover, the steam and smoke and the flames which the Firedrake spouted like foam from his nostrils would have daunted even the bravest man. The sides of the hill, too, were covered with the blackened ashes of his victims, whom he had roasted when they came out to kill him. The garden engine of poor little Alfonso was lying in the valley, and broken and useless. But the Firedrake was as happy as a wild duck on a lonely lake, and rolling and diving in the liquid flame, and red hot and full of frolic. "Hi!" shouted the prince. The Firedrake rose to the surface, his horns as red as a red crescent moon, only bigger, and lashing the fire with his hooves and his blazing tail. "What's there?" he said in a hoarse, angry voice. "Just let me get at you." "It's me," answered the prince. It was the first time he had ever forgotten his grammar, but he was terribly excited. "What do you want?" grunted the beast. "I wish I could see you." And, horrible to relate, he rose on a pair of wide, flaming wings and came right to the prince, guided by the sound of his voice. Now, the prince had never heard that Fairdrakes could fly. Indeed, he had never believed in them at all, till the night before. For a moment he was numb with terror. Then he flew down like a stone to the very bottom of the hill and shouted, "Hi!" "Well," Firedrake, "what's the matter? Can't you give a civil answer to a civil question?" "Will you go back to your hole and swear on your honor as a Firedrake to listen quietly?" "On my sacred word of honor," said the beast, casually scorching an eagle that flew by it to ashes. The cinders fell, jingling and crackling around the prince with a little shower. Then the Firedrake dived back with an awful splash of flame, and the mountain roared around it. The prince now flew high above him and cried, "A message from the Remora. He says you are afraid to fight him." "Don't know him," grunted Drake. "He sends you his glove," said Prince Prigio, "at the challenge of mortal combat, till death do you part." Then he dropped his own glove into the fiery lake. "Does he?" "Just let me get at him." And he scrambled out, all red hot as he was. "I'll go and tell him you're coming," said the prince. And with 2 strides, he was over the frozen mountain. Chapter 10. The Prince and the Remora. If he had been too warm before, the prince was too cold now. The hill of the Remora was one solid mass of frozen steel, and the cold rushed out of it like a breath of some icy beast, which indeed it was. All around were things like marble statues of men in armor. They were all the dead bodies of the knights, horses and all, who had gone out to the hold to fight the Remora, and who had been frosted up by him. The prince felt his blood stand still, and he grew faint, but he took heart, for there was no time to waste. Yet he could nowhere see the Remora. "Hi!" shouted the prince. Then from a narrow chink at the bottom of the smooth black hill, a chink no deeper than that under a door, but a mile wide, stole out a hideous head. It was as flat as a head of a scapefish. It was deathly pale, but 2 chill blue eyes, dead-colored like stones, looked out of it. Then there came a whisper like the breath of a bitter east wind on a wintry day. "What are you, and how come I aid you?" "Here I am," said the prince from the top of the hill. Then the flat white head set itself against the edge of the chink, which had peaked, and slowly, at the movement of a sheet of ice, it slipped forward and curled upwards, and up, and up. There seemed to be no end of it at all, and it moved horribly, without feet, holding on by its own frost to the slippery side of the frozen hill. Now all the lower part of the black hill was covered with a horrid white thing, coiled about it in smooth, flat, shiny coils. And still the head was higher than the rest, and still the icy cold came nearer and nearer, like death. The prince almost fainted. Everything seemed to swim, and in one moment more he would have fallen stiff on the mountain top, and the white head would have crawled under him, and the cold coils would have slipped him over and turned him into stone. And still the thing slipped up from the chink under the mountain. But the prince made a great effort. He moved in, and in 2 steps he was far away, down in the valley, where it was not so very cold. "Hi!" he shouted, as soon as his tongue could move within his shattered teeth. There came a clear, hissing answer, like frozen words dropping around him. "Wait till I come down. What do you want?" And the white folds began to slide like melting ice from the black hill. Prince Prigio felt the air getting warmer behind him, colder in front of him. He looked around, and there were trees beginning to blacken from the heat, and the grass looking like a sea of fire along the plains, for the Firedrake was coming. The prince took time to shout, "The Firedrake is coming to pay you a visit!" And then he soared to the top of a neighboring hill, and looked on at what followed. Chapter 9. The Battle. The Battle. It was an awful sight to behold. When the remora heard his name of the Firedrake, his hated enemy, he slipped with wonderful speed from the cleft of the mountain into the valley. On and on and on he poured over rock and tree, as if a frozen river could slide downhill. On and on, till there were miles of him stretching along the valley, miles of smooth-ribbed, icy creature crawling, slipping forwards. The green trees dropped their leaves as he advanced. The birds fell down dead from the sky, slain by his frosty breath. But fast as the remora stole forward, the Firedrake came quicker yet, flying and clashing his fiery wings. At last they were within striking distance. The Firedrake, stooping from the air, dashed with his burning horns and flaming feet slap into the body of the remora. Then there rose a steam so dreadful, such as a white yet fiery vapor of heat, that no one who had not the prince's magic glass could have seen what was happening. With horrid grunts and roars, the Firedrake tried to burn his way right through the flat body of the remora and chase him to his cleft in the rock. But the remora, hissing terribly and visibly melting away in places, yet held his ground, and the prince could see his cold white folds climbing slowly to the roof of the Clodia. But the remora, and the prince could see his cold white folds climbing slowly up the hoofs of the Firedrake, up and up till they reached his knees, and the great burning beast roared like 100 bulls in pain. Then up the Firedrake leaped, and hovering on his fiery wings, he lighted in the midst of the remora's back, and dashed with its horns. But the flat, cruel head writhed backwards, and slowly bending over itself, the wounded remora slid greedily to fasten again on the limbs of the Firedrake. Meanwhile, the prince, safe on his hill, was lunching on the loaf and the cold tongue he had brought with him. "Go for it, remora! Get it, Firedrake! You're gaining! Give it to him, remora!" he shouted in the wildest excitement. Nobody had ever seen such a battle. He had it all to himself, and he never enjoyed anything more. He hated the remora so much that he almost wished the Firedrake could beat it, for the Firedrake was a more natural beast of the pair. Still, he was alarmed when he saw that the vast flat body of the remora was now slowly coiling backwards and backwards into the cleft below the hill, while the thick wet mist showed how cruelly it had suffered. But the Firedrake, too, was in an unhappy way, for his legs were now cold and black. His horns were black also, though his body, especially near his heart, glowed still like a red-hot iron. "Go for it, remora!" cried the prince. "His legs are giving way. He's groggy in his pins. One more effort, and he won't be able to move." Encouraged by this advice, the white and slippery remora streamed out of his cavern again, more and more of him uncoiling, as if the mountain were quite full of him. He had lost strength, no doubt, for the steam and the mist went up from him in clouds, and the hissing of his very angry voice grew fainter, but so did the roars of the Firedrake. Presently they sounded more like groans, and at last the remora slipped his legs above his knees and fastened to his very heart of fire. Then the Firedrake stood, groaning like a black bull, knee-deep in snow, and still the remora climbed and climbed. "Go it now, Firedrake!" shouted the prince, for he knew it was the remora one. It would have been too cold for him to draw near the place, and cut off the Firedrake's head and tail. "Go it, Drake! He's slacking!" cried the prince again. And the brave Firedrake made one last furious effort, and rising on his wings, dropped just on the spine of the enemy. The wounded remora curled back his head again on himself, and again crawled, steaming terribly towards his enemy. But the struggle was too much for the gallant remora. The flat, cruel head moved slower, and the steam from his 1,000 wounds grew fiercer, and he gently breathed his last, just as the Firedrake, too, fell over and lay exhausted. With one final roar, like the breath of 1,000 furnaces, the Firedrake expired. The prince, watching from the hilltop, could scarcely believe that these two awful scourges of nature, which had so long devastated his country, were actually dead. But when he looked over half an hour, and only the river ran where the remora had been, while the body of the Firedrake lay stark and cold, he hurried to the spot. Drawing with a sword of sharpness, he hacked off with 2 blows the iron head and the tail of the Firedrake. They were a weary weight to carry, but in a few strides of the shoes of swiftness he was back at the castle, where he threw down his burden, and nearly fainted with excitement and fatigue. But the castle clock struck 7:30. Dinner was at 8, and the poor prince crawled on hands and knees to the garret, where he put on the wishing cap and wished for a pint of champagne, a hot bath, and his best black velvet and diamond suit. In a moment these were provided. He bathed, dressed, and drank the glass of wine. He packed up the head and tail of the Firedrake, and sat down on his fine carpet, and knocked at the door of the English ambassador as the clocks were striking 8 in Blackstone. Punctuality is the politeness of princes, and a prince is polite when he is in love. The prince was received at the door by a stout porter, and led into the hall, where several butlers met him, and he laid the mortal remains of the Firedrake under the cover of the flying carpet. Then he was led upstairs, and he made his bow to the pretty lady, who, of course, made him a magnificent curtsy. She seemed prettier and kinder than ever. The prince was so happy that he never noticed how something went about the dinner. Wrong about the dinner. The ambassador looked about, and seemed to miss someone, and spoke in a low voice to one of the servants, who also answered in a low voice, and what he seemed to displease the ambassador. But the prince was so busy in talking to his lady and eating the dinner, that he never observed anything unusual. He had never been at such a pleasant dinner. Chapter 12. A Terrible Misfortune. When the ladies left, and the prince and the other gentlemen were alone, the ambassador appeared more gloomy than ever. At last he took the prince into a corner, on pretense of showing him a rare statue. "Does your royal highness not know," he asked, "that you are in considerable danger?" "Still," said the prince, thinking of the Firedrake. The ambassador did not know what he meant, for he had never heard of the fight, but he answered gravely, "Never more than now." Then he showed the prince 2 proclamations which had been posted all over the town. Here is the first. "To all loyal subjects, whereas our eldest son, Prince Prigio, hath of late been guilty of several high crimes and misdemeanors. First, by abandoning the post of danger against the Firedrake, whereby our beloved sons Prince Alfonso and Prince Enrico had perished, and have been overdone by that monster. Secondly, by attending an unseemly revel in the town of Buxton where he brawled in the streets. Thirdly, by trying to seduce away the hearts of loyal subjects in that city, and to blow up a party against our crown and peace. This is to give warning that whoever consorts with, comforts, aids, and abets the Prince Prigio is thereby a partner in his treason, and that a reward of 5,000 purses will be given to whoever brings the said prince alive to our castle in Falkenstein. Regrino R. Here is the second proclamation. Reward the Firedrake. Whereas our domains have lately been devastated by a Firedrake, the Salamander Furiosus of Buffon, this is to advise all that whoever brings the horns and tail of the said Firedrake to our castle in Falkenstein shall receive 5,000 purses, the position of crown prince, with the usual prerequisites, and the hand of the king's niece, the Lady Molinda. Said the prince. I do not think his majesty wrote so well. And he would have liked to say, don't you think we might join the ladies? But, sir, said the ambassador, the streets are lined with soldiers, and I do not know how you have escaped them. Here, under my roof, you are safe for the moment, but a prolonged stay, excuse my inhospitality, could not but restrain the harmonious relations which prevail between the government of Panthruflia and that which I have the honor to represent. You don't want to fight, and no more, I think you do, said the prince, smiling. Then how does your royal highness mean to treat these proclamations? Why, by winning these 10,000 purses. I can tell you, £1,000,000 is worth having, said the prince. I'll deliver up as the prince of Falkenstein this very night, also with the horns and tails, said Firedrake. But I don't want to marry my cousin Molly. May I remind your royal highness that Falkenstein is 300 miles away. Moreover, my head butler Benson discovered from the house before dinner, and I fear he went to warn Captain Kozovsky that you are here. Now that is nothing, said the prince. But my dear Lord Kelso, may I not have the pleasure of presenting Lady Rosalind with a little gift, a Philippine which I lost to her last night, merely the head and tail of the Firedrake, which I stalked this morning. The ambassador was so astonished that he ran straight upstairs, forgetting his manner and crying, Linda, Linda, come down here at once. There's a surprise for you. Lady Rosalind came sweeping down with a smile on her kind face. She guessed what it was, though the prince had said nothing about it at dinner. Lead your way, the royal highness, cried the ambassador, and the prince, offering Lady Rosalind his arm, went down the hall, where he saw neither his carpet nor the horns and tail of the Firedrake. He turned quite pale and said, Will you kindly ask the servants where the little Persian prayer rug and the parcel which I had brought with me have been placed? Lord Kelso rang the bell, and in came the servants, with William, the under-butler, at their head. William, said his lordship, where have you put the royal highness's parcel with its carpet? Please, your lordship, said William, we think Benson took them away with him. And where is Benson? We don't know, your lordship. We think he have come for... Come for by whom? William stammered, seemed at a loss. But, quick, answer. What do you know about it? William said at last, rather as if he were making a speech. Your Royalness and my lords and ladies, it was like this. His Royalness come in with the rug under his arm and the summit under it, and he lays it down there he sits, and Thomas shows him to the droning room. Then Benson says, dinner will be ready in 5 minutes. How tired I feel. Then he takes the liberty of sitting himself down on his Royalness's rug and says, asking your pardon, I've had enough of service here. I'm about tired, and thinks of bettering myself. I wish I was at the king's court and butler. But before his words were out of his mouth, off he flies like a shot through the open door, and his Royalness's parcel with him. I run to the door, and there he was, flying right over the town in a northerly direction. And that's all I know, for I would not tell a lie. Not if ever so. and me and Thomas, who didn't see it, and the cook, who thinks Sir Benson come for. The cook says that she don't wonder it's either, for a grumblinger more ill-conditioned. Thank you, William, said Lord Kelso. That will do. You can go for presents. Oops. Chapter 13. Surprises. The prince said nothing, and the ambassador said nothing. Lady Rosalind said never a word till they were in the drawing room. It was a lovely warm evening, and the French windows were wide open to the balcony, which looked over the town and away north to the hills. Below them floated clear green water of the Lochthal, and still nobody said a word. At last the prince spoke. This is a very strange story, Lord Kelso. Very so, said the ambassador. But true, added the prince. At least there is no reason in the nature of things why it shouldn't be true. I can hardly believe, sir, that the conduct of Benson, whom I have always found a most respectable man, deserved that he should be come for, said the prince. Oh no, it was a mere accident, and might have happened to any of us who chanced to sit down on my carpet. And then the prince told them, shortly, all about it, how the carpet was one of a number of fairy properties which had been given him at his christening, and how a long time had gone before he discovered them, and how probably the carpet had carried the butler where he said he wanted to go, namely to the king's court in Falkenstein. It would not matter so much, added the prince, had I only relied on marking my peace with His Majesty my father by aid of those horns and that tail. He was set on getting them, and if Lady Rosalind had not expressed a wish for them, they would today have been in his possession. Oh, sir, you honour us too highly, murmured Lady Rosalind, and the prince blushed and said, Not at all, impossible. Then, of course, the ambassador became quite certain that his daughter was admired by the crown prince, who was on bad terms with the king of the country, and a more uncomfortable position for an ambassador. However, they are used to them. What on earth am I to do with the young man, he thought. He can't stay here forever, and without his carpet he can't get away, for the soldiers have orders to seize him as soon as he appears in the street. And in the meantime, Benson will be pretending that he killed the Firedrake, for he must have got to Falkenstein by now, and they will be marrying him to the king's niece, and making my butler the crown prince of the kingdom of Pantufia. It is dreadful. Now, all this time, the prince was on the balcony, telling Lady Rosalind about how he got the Firedrake done for, in the most modest way. For, as he said, I didn't really kill him. It was really the immoral, poor fellow, who should marry Molly. But he's dead. At this moment, there was a whiz through the air. Something shot past him, and through the open door, and the king and queen, Benson, and the mortal remains of the Firedrake, were shot into the ambassador's drawing room. Chapter 14. The King Explains. The first who recovered his voice and presence of mind was Benson. Did your lordship ring for coffee? He asked quietly, and when he was told yes, he bowed and withdrew, majestic composure. When he had gone, the prince threw himself at the king's feet, crying, Pardon, pardon, my liege. Don't speak to me, sir, answered the king very angrily, and the poor prince threw himself at the feet of the queen. But she took no notice of him whatever, no more than if he had been a fairy. The prince heard her murmur, and she pinched her royal arms. I shall awaken presently, and this is nothing out of the way of a dream. Dr. Rumpino prescribes it an imperfect nutrition. All this time, the Lady Rosalind, as pale as a marble statue, was leaning against the side of the open window. The prince thought he could do nothing wiser than to go and comfort her, so he induced her to sit down on a chair on the balcony, for he felt that he was not wanted in the drawing room. And soon they were talking happily about the stars, which had begun to appear in that summer night. Meanwhile, the ambassador had induced the king to take a seat, but there was no use in talking to the queen. It would be a miracle, she said to herself. The miracles do not happen, therefore this has not happened. Presently I shall wake up in my own bed in Falkenstein. Now, Benson, William, and Thomas brought in the coffee, but the Queen took no notice. When they went away, the rest of the company slipped off quietly, and the King was left alone with the ambassador, for the Queen could hardly be said to count. "You want to know all about it, I suppose," said His Majesty in a sullen voice. "Well, you have a right, and I shall tell you. You were just sitting down to dinner at Falkenstein, rather late. Ours get later every year, I think, when I heard a row on the premise, and the captain of the guard, Colonel MacDougall, came and told us that the man had arrived with the horns and tail of the Firedrake, and was claiming the reward. Her Majesty and I rose and went to the outer court, where we found, sitting on that carpet with a glass of beer in his hand, a respectable-looking upper servant, whom I recognized as her butler. He informed us that he had just killed the beast, and showed us the horns and tail. Sure enough, there they were. The tail was like an iron handle of a pump, but the horns were genuine. The pair were grown up by a volcano, and in my great-grandfather's time, King Leo I. Excellent coffee this, of yours." The ambassador bowed. "Well, we asked him where he put the Firedrake, and he said in a garden near Gluckstone. Then he began to speak about the reward, and how the perquisites, as he called them, which it seemed to have read from my proclamation. Rather a neat thing. Drew up myself, His Majesty." "Very much to the point," said the ambassador, wondering what the king was coming to. "Glad you like it," said the king, much pleased. "Well, where was I? Oh, yes. Your man said he had killed the creature in a garden quite near Gluckstone. I didn't much like the whole affair. He is an alien, in the end. Then there's my niece, Melinda. Poor girl. She was certain to give trouble. Her heart buried, if I may say so, with poor Alfonso. But the Queen is a very remarkable woman. Very remarkable." "Very," said the ambassador with perfect truth. "Caitiff," she cries. "Caitiff," she cries to her butler. His Majesty went on. "Perturbed knave, thou liest in my throat. Gluckstone is 100 leagues from here, and how sayest thou that thou slewest the monster, and camest hither in a few hours' space?" This had not occurred to me. I am a plain king, and once I saw the force of Her Majesty's argument. "Yes," I said. "How did you manage it?" But he, your man I mean, was not a bit put out. "Why, your Majesty," says he, "I just sat down on that bit of carpet and wished I was here, and here I am. And I'd be glad, having the trouble, and my time not being my own, to see the color of them perquisites, according to the proclamation." On this Her Majesty grew more indignant, if possible. "Nonsense," she cried. "A story out of the Arabian Nights is not suited for a modern public, and fails to win aesthetic credence." These were her very words. "Her Majesty's expressions are ever choice and appropriate," said the ambassador. "Sit down there on the carpet, knave," she went on. "Ourself and consort, meaning me, will take our places by thy side, and I shall wish us in Gluckstone at thy master's. When the experiment had failed, thy head shall from thy shoulders be shorn." So your man merely said, "Very well, mum, your Majesty, I mean," and he sat down. Queen took her place at the edge of the carpet. I sat between her and the butler, and she said, "I wish I were in Gluckstone." Then you rose and flew through the air at an astonishing pace, and here we are. So I suppose the rest of the butler's tale is true, which I regret, but a king's word is sacred, and shall take the place of that snake Prigio. But as we left home before dinner, and as yours is over, may I request your lordship to believe that I would be delighted to take something cold." The ambassador at once ordered a sumptuous collation, to which the king did full justice, and His Majesty was shown to the royal chamber as he complained of fatigue. The Queen accompanied him, remarking that she was sound asleep, but would waken presently. Neither of them said good night to the prince. Indeed, they did not see him again, for he was on the balcony with Lady Rosamond. They found a great deal to say to each other, and at last the prince asked her to be his wife, and she said that if the king and her father gave their permission, why then she would. After this she went to bed, and the prince, who had not slept at all the night before, felt very sleepy also, but he knew that he first had something that must be done. So he went to the drawing room, took his carpet, and wished to be now, where do you suppose? Beside the dead body of the Firedrake. There he was in a moment, and the dreadful body looked, lying stark and cold in the white moonshine. Then the prince cut off his 4 hooves and put them in his wallet, and with these he flew back in a second, and met the ambassador just as he came from ushering the king to bed. Then the king was shown to his room. Then the prince was shown to his room, where he locked up the hooves, the carpet, and the cap of darkness, and his other things in an iron box. And so he went to bed, and dreamed of his lady Rosalind. Chapter 15. The King's Check. When they all awakened next morning, their first ideas were confused. It is often confusing to wake in a strange bed, much more so when you have flown through the air, like the king and queen and Benson the butler. For her part, the queen was most perplexed of all, for she was undeniably awake, yet she was not at home where she had expected to be. However, she was a determined woman and stood to it that nothing unusual was occurring. The butler made up his mind to claim the crown, princeship, and the hand of Lady Melinda, because he was justly remarked to William, here was not such a chance to better himself as he might soon have come his way again. As for the king, he was only anxious to get back to Falkenstein and have the whole situation settled in a constitutional manner. The ambassador was not sorry to get rid of the royal party, and it was proposed that they should all sit down on a fine carpet and wish themselves at home again. But the queen would not hear of it. She said it was childish and impossible. So the carriage was got ready for her, and she started without saying a word of goodbye to anyone. The king, Benson, and the prince were not so particular, and they simply flew back to Falkenstein in the usual way, arriving there at 11:35, a week before Her Majesty. The king at once held a court, and the horns and tail of the monster were exhibited amidst general interest, and Benson and the prince were invited to state their claims. Benson's evidence was taken first. He declined to say exactly where or how he killed the Firedrake. There might be more of them left, he remarked, young ones that would take a lot of killing, and he refused to part with his secret. Only he claimed the reward which was offered, if you remember, not to the man who killed the beast, but to him who brought its horns and tail. This was allowed by Laura's President to be a very sound law, and Benson was cheered by his courtiers, who decidedly preferred him to Prigio, and who, besides, thought he was going to be crown prince. As for Lady Melinda, she was torn by the most painful feelings, for much as she hated Prigio, she could not bear the idea of marrying Benson. Yet one or the other choice seemed certain. Unhappy lady. Perhaps no girl was ever more strangely beset by misfortune. Prince Prigio was now called to speak. He admitted that the reward was offered in bringing the horns and tail, not for killing the monster. But were the king's intentions to go for nothing? When a subject only meant well, of course he had to suffer, but when a king said one thing and he was not supposed to have meant another, any fellow with a wagon could bring the horns and tail. The difficult thing was to kill the monster. If Benson's claim was allowed, the royal prerogative of saying one thing and meaning something else was in danger. On hearing this argument, the king so far forgot himself as to cry, "Bravo! Well said!" and to clap his hands, whereupon all the courtiers shouted and threw up their hats. The prince then said that whoever killed the monster could, of course, tell where to find him, and could bring his hoofs. He was ready to do this himself. Was Mr. Benson equally ready? On this being interpreted to him, for he did not speak Pentuffian, Benson grew pale with horror, but fell back on the proclamation. He had brought the horns and tail, and so he must have the prerequisites, and the Lady Melinda. The king's mind was so much confused by this time that he determined to leave it to Lady Melinda herself. "Which of them will you have, my dear?" he asked in a kind voice. The poor Melinda merely cried, Then His Majesty was almost driven to say that he would give the reward to whoever produced the hooves by the next week. But no sooner had he said this than the prince brought them out of his vault and displayed them in the open court. This ended the case, and Benson, after being entertained with sherry and sandwiches in the steward's room, was sent back to his master. And I regret to say that his temper was not at all improved by his failure to better himself. On the contrary, he was unusually cross and disagreeable for several days, but we must, perhaps, make some allowance for his disappointment. But if Benson was irritated and suffered from the remarks of his fellow servants, I do not think we can envy Prince Prigio. Here he was, restored to his position indeed, but by no means to the royal favor, for the king disliked him as much as ever, and was as angry as ever about the deaths of Enrico and Alfonso. Nay, he was even more angry, perhaps not without reason. He called up Prigio before the whole court, and thereupon the courtiers cheered like anything, but the king cried, "Silence! MacDougall, drag the first man that shouts to the serpent house in the zoological gardens and lock him up with the rattlesnakes." After that, the courtiers became very quiet. "Prince," said the king as Prigio bowed before him, "you are restored to your position, because I cannot break my promise. But your base and malevolent nature is even more conspicuously manifest in your selfish success than in your previous desperate contempt for duty. Why, confound you!" cried the king, dropping his high style in which he had been speaking, and becoming the father, not the monarch. "Why, if you could kill the Firedrake, did you let your poor brothers go and be broiled? What do you say, you sneak? You didn't believe there were Firedrakes? This just comes of your eternal conceit and arrogance. If you were clever enough to kill the creature, and I admit you were clever enough to know that everybody must be true, you have not generally found it so. Well, you have this time, and let it be a lesson to you. Not that there is much comfort in that, for it is not likely that you will ever have such another chance." Exactly the idea that occurred to Benson. Here the king wept, among the tears of the Lord Chief Justice and Poet Laureate, who had been awfully frightened when he heard the rattlesnakes, the maids of honor and chaplain royal, and everyone but Colonel MacDonald, a Scottish soldier of fortune who maintained a military reserve. When His Majesty had recovered, he said to Prigio, who had not been crying, as he was too much absorbed, "King's word is his bond. Bring me a pen and my royal checkbook." The royal checkbook, bound in red morocco, was brought in by 8 pages with ink and a pen. His Majesty then filled and signed the following satisfactory documents. Ah, my children, how I wish Mr. Arrowsmith would have as much as he... I wish Mr. Arrowsmith would do as much for me. It's actually got a picture of the check. Number WOB 961047. Balkenstein, July 10th, 1768. The Bank of Pantuflia, Falconstonebridge. Paid to Prince Prigio of the order of 10,000 purses. £1,000,000. Revenue R. "There," said His Majesty, crossing his check and throwing sand over it, for blotting paper had not yet been invented. "There, take it, and be off with you." Prince Prigio was respectfully but rapidly obeying his royal command, for he thought he had better cash the royal check as soon as possible, when His Majesty yelled, "Hey, here, come back. I forgot something. You've got to marry Belinda." I am going to end that here for tonight. 14 chapters. No, 15 chapters. So, almost halfway through Prince Prigio. So, we need to find someone to raid. It is a really interesting story. And it really is along the lines of how I'm writing my own lore. It just involves items from other fairy tales, and it's actually kind of cool. So, but yeah, I need to find someone to raid. And this is just the first book, because the second book is about his son. So that'll be even more interesting. Because the son inherits all these things. Oh, at least I assume he does. Because he's the son. But do we have anyone to raid tonight? Let's see. Anyone reading? No, race is still going, I think. Check. Yeah, waste is still going. Let's go ahead and read wastes. There are the raid messages as usual. And I have added this book to my list on Bookshop, so it's there. No. They do have it in hardback and paperback. I just tag hardback instinctively. But yeah. Let's go ahead and get over to wastes. I hope everyone has a great night, and try to picture other fairy tale items that could end up in the story. Because there were seats for 100 people to show up at his christening. And fairies came and showed up. All but 99 gave him gifts. And one of them cursed him with brilliance. Yeah. Have a good night, everyone.
In the hollow of the night, shadows weave and twist. The wolf has told his stories, wrapped in mystic mist, lurking in the silence where the echoes softly play. The echoes of forgotten tales, dimming as they sway. The hours drip like candle wax, slowly melting gold. Lands of frost and twilight, secrets yet untold. The forest breathes a shiver, its ancient heartbeats thrum. Underneath the silver glow, the wild whispers come. Time to close the book, let the pages fall. You've roamed the winding paths, now heed the twilight call. The moon is setting low, a